for coming out tonight on this little bit of a rainy evening. Our speaker, I think, brought some Irish weather with her, put us in the mood for some Walter Osborne paintings. So this is the first in our series of 3 lectures related to the exhibition Homecoming, Walter Osborne's Portraits of Dublin, 1880 to 1900. The remaining 2 lectures will be in November when curators Brendan Rooney and Logan Sisley from the National Gallery of Ireland and the Hugh Lane Gallery, respectively, will bring their insights to bear on one of Ireland's most heralded 19th century artists, Walter Osborne. My name is Cheryl Snee. I'm the curator of European and American art before 1900 here at the Raclin Murphy Museum. And hopefully you've had a chance to see the exhibition already. If not, we're open late tomorrow until about 7:30, and then we're open on the weekends, Saturday and Sunday, from noon until 5. And then we're open during the weekdays, except Mondays, from 10 until 5. So there should be plenty of time for you to come back. The exhibition doesn't close until December 7th. So lots of time to come back and see it again if you've already seen it or see it for the first time. Before we get into the meat of tonight's event, though, I need to acknowledge our very generous benefactors without whom there would be no exhibition or catalog, which incidentally is available for sale in our shop. So a little bit of shameless promotion there. Foremost among them is the Donald and Marilyn Keogh Foundation has long supported our efforts to study, research, and push to the forefront Irish visual arts. From their first gift of 14 paintings to their establishment of a curatorial fellowship to help achieve this singular project, the Keogh family has been fundamental to our mission of scholarship, teaching, and learning for many years. And of course, their dedication to the University of Notre Dame in general is legendary. We also need to recognize the J. Breen and Maggie Murphy Endowment for Exhibitions, the James and Barbara O'Connell Family Fund for Exhibitions, and the Friends of the Raclin Murphy Museum of Art Charter membership. And as always, we have benefited from our ever-expanding partnerships with Rare Books and Special Collections, and there's a couple of people here from there tonight, at the Hesburgh Libraries, and especially the Keogh Naughton Institute for Irish Studies, who bring valuable expertise and unending collegiality to all of our collaborations. Tonight, we're fortunate to host Dr. Kathryn Milligan, who comes to us from the National College of Art and Design in Dublin, and who earned her BA from University College Dublin and both her master's and Ph.D. in art history from Trinity College. Her research interests have focused on the depiction of Dublin and the city as a site of exhibition, display, and artistic exchange. She's published widely in Ireland and the UK and delivered numerous papers at international conferences, some of which even featured the Raclin Murphy's own painting At the Breakfast Table, which is the centerpiece of the present exhibition. Most recently, she was the co-curator of the exhibition Kazimierz Markowicz, a Polish artist in Bohemian Dublin, 1903 to 1913, and that just closed at the Dublin Castle just this past week, I believe. She's probably best known, however, as the author of the award-winning volume Painting Dublin, 1886 to 1949, which was published in 2020. There she dedicated an entire chapter to Osborne. After reading that book, it was clear that I needed to invite her to contribute to our own exhibition catalog. She graciously accepted the invitation, submitting the essay At the Breakfast Table, Walter Osborne, Family Life and the Interior Scene. Tonight, she's going to expand and elaborate on that essay in her presentation, At Home, Walter Osborne's Paintings of Family Life. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathryn Milligan.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much, Cheryl, for that lovely introduction and for the very kind invitation to come and speak this evening. I'd also like to extend my thanks to Judith Stapleton and Aoife Marie Buckley, who have also been working on this exhibition and who have been helpful in lots of different ways as we've gotten from the initial invitation to this point, which is very exciting. I also just want to make a very special mention to Grace, my wife, who is spending her birthday listening to me talk about a 19th century Irish artist. And if that's not true love, I don't know, I don't know what is. So anyway, so as you can see from this slide, this evening I'm going to talk about Walter Osborne's paintings of family life, really centering on the beautiful painting at the breakfast table, which is on view, as Cheryl said, the centerpiece to the exhibition upstairs. I'm very grateful to be the first speaker in this series because it means I can get to go into all of the wonderful biographical detail as well. And I'm sure by the end of this series you will know everything there is to know about Walter Osborne. So let's meet him and get started. So I hope you maybe have had a chance to see this beautiful photograph which is reproduced in the exhibition upstairs. This shows Walter Osborne in his studio in around the late 1880s, early 1890s. It was taken potentially by the artist himself. It's unknown photographer, but I think even to our contemporary eye, it has a little bit of a look of the selfie about it. It is incredibly carefully posed. The artist sitting in a kind of portrait chair, he's looking at the camera, his arms folded, and this set of paintings, drawings, and other objects behind him in the photograph with the studio door closed. This photograph brings us right into the heart of the Osborne family home, and that was in Rathmines, which is a suburb lying to the south of Dublin. Perhaps some of you have been there, been lucky enough to enjoy Rathmines, but it is a very interesting part of Dublin's history. It lies to the south of the Grand Canal, and it was founded in the 1840s as an independent township, lying outside of the traditional city boundary. It was largely Protestant and Unionist in its municipal government, and it was, in fact, its purpose was to be a counterpoint to the Catholic-controlled municipal council in Dublin city centre. It was home to well-to-do professional families, and this was very much reflected in the Osborne family and in their friends and acquaintances, who were drawn from the city's professional middle classes and included scholars, doctors, lawyers, and artists with affiliation ranging across the political and religious spectrum. This is a late 19th century photograph showing the main street in Rathmines with its beautiful clock tower and its shops. It looks very similar today, minus the tram and the horses. But just along where these awnings lie on the right-hand side of the photograph, there is a turn down to Castlewood Avenue. This is where the Osborne family lived, so we'll introduce you briefly here to Walter's parents. William Osborne, a well-known painter in his own right, and his mother, Anne Jane Osborne. The couple had married in 1855, and by 1869, they had settled at number 5 Castlewood Avenue. This is me, outside of number 5 Castlewood Avenue, which you can see just behind with the kind of small plaque outside. I had hoped to go and get a different picture to show you, but the weather was just so nice in this one, and I hope the bike and myself give you a sense of scale of the house as well. So, as I say, this was quite a new street when the Osbornes moved into it, and it was in fact advertised for rent in the 1840s. So Castlewood Avenue was one of the first streets laid out in Rathmines. So you can see here the newspaper advertisement showing the house, and it's probably not much longer after this that they rented it. So I'm going to just describe the house. It was comprised of an elevated basement level, so on the same level as the steps, with a large kitchen, 2 pantries, a china closet, a middle floor with 2 parlours connected by sliding doors, a handsome hall and a spacious drawing room, and finally a bedroom level with 4 rooms, a bathroom and a water closet. It also had an unusually large garden and a water pump and a large tank for rainwater, and the rent was about £65 per annum. So I kind of go into those details just to show that this was a well-to-do area. They were a prosperous family, mod cons, water, bedrooms, a kitchen level. They were very comfortable in this house. And this is important for, as you'll see as we go on. So let's look finally then at some artwork. This is both a letter and a sketch on one sheet, which again you can see upstairs. It was written in February 1895 by Walter Osborne to his brother-in-law, William Stockley. As you can see, the writing is a little bit hard to decipher, so I'm just going to read a bit for you. It says, "Dear Willie, this was painted in the back room looking towards the drawing room window," so out towards me and my bicycle. "The folding doors are open, and through them you can see a window in sunlight. White cloth on the table, breakfast things and a jar of flowers. Baby seated on her own high chair. The best picture I think I have done. I am sending it to this year's Royal Academy." So the work that Osborne is sketching is, of course, at the breakfast table, which you can see upstairs, acquired by the Raclin Murphy Museum in 2019. The baby, the little girl, was William Stockley's infant daughter and the artist's niece, and she's painted with her grandfather William and her grandmother Anne. Many things are contained within this sketch and short note that I've just shown you. It is an artist's account of his latest work, sent to a close, confidant and family member, but it's also a textual and visual image of a young child's progress and her achievement of sitting up at the table. By the time he wrote to William Stockley, Osborne had already exhibited this work in Dublin at the Dublin Arts Club at their annual exhibition. This was a very important artist society in Dublin at the time, and of which Osborne was a prominent member. Importantly, it was known for its cultivation of connections with British and French art. So this is very much the milieu that Osborne wanted to position himself in. And it was a hub for the Dublin cultural intelligentsia, so very much the people he was socialising with in Rathmines. It was noted in the Irish Times. This painting, which we know is at the breakfast table, was known at the time as Portraits, so quite a different title. But the Irish Times wrote that it was possibly the best work in the whole exhibition. It represents a family group consisting of father, mother, and child, and in its every detail is truly worthy of the high reputation of the artist. The expression of the faces are particularly presented with force and true artistic finish. It may be hailed as one of the best of Mr. Osborne's recent productions. So they don't quite have the people right, but I think we can agree that the general sentiment is correct. There is little doubt, in my mind anyway, that At the Breakfast Table is among the most accomplished of his domestic interiors. Like the photograph and like the exterior of the house itself, it is showing a comfortable middle-class home. This beautiful table with its linen tablecloth, fine porcelain, bone-handle cutlery, silverware, flowers in an earthenware jug, bread, a carving knife, and these doting grandparents sitting feeding baby Violet with a literal silver spoon. Something that maybe doesn't come across in reproduction, but if you can get up to see it upstairs, is just the gentleness and interest in the brushstrokes, the way that Osborne uses small dabs of paint to suggest a toy, the silver spoon, the curve of the plate, really beautiful and simple things that just bring this painting to life. So if you'll forgive me a little bit of art historying for a moment, but just to give some context for it. Claire Moran, a scholar from Queen's University in Belfast, has recently written that in the 19th century, the interior became an emblem of subjectivity, intellectual life, and increasingly the separation of private and public. It was singled out by literary figures such as Stéphane Mallarmé or Edmond Durante, so she's particularly talking about France, as the key stage for the representation of modern life. Moran draws attention to the dichotomy between the home as being a place of privacy and respite, but also when it's represented in art or literature as a place of public consumption, and how these two things are in tension, the public, the private, the exterior and interior, and how these play out in the representation of 19th century life. And I think that's something we see in At the Breakfast Table. On the one hand, it's a record of a family, and just even without knowing anything about the sitters, it is a very fine example of a 19th century domestic interior. So let's keep that in our mind. But let's look at the Osborne family in a little more detail. And really, I suppose this is the story of how Violet Stockley, the little girl, came to be living with her grandparents and uncle in Dublin while her father was in Canada. So William and Anne Osborne had 4 children, 3 of whom survived into adulthood. Charles Edward, who you see here in the upper corner, he was the eldest of their children, born in 1856. Walter was in the middle, he was born in 1859, and Violet, who you see here, was born in 1866. They did have a 3rd son who died very shortly after he was born in 1869. In 1921, the author and politician Stephen Gwynne, who we're going to hear a lot about, included an account of his friendship with the Osborne family in his autobiography. And this gives us a lovely insight into the life of the house and the family's dynamics. From Gwynne's account, it's clear that Violet, who we see here, was at the heart of the home. He wrote, "The life and soul of it was his sister. She was the youngest child, and the father and mother left all the direction of their hospitality to this brilliant girl. So helpful, so self-reliant, bright, with so varying a beauty, whose voice had ripples in it like a running stream." I think he maybe was a little bit in love with her himself from that description. It's very lively, and I think his description is matched in this portrait, which you can see, which isn't in the exhibition, so I wanted to show it to you. This is by John Butler Yeats, father of William and Jack, Elizabeth and Susan, that prodigious family in Irish art and literature through the late 19th and early 20th century. But it captures everything that is great about John Butler Yeats's portraiture. It is lively, it's full of texture, that direct gaze between the sitter and the artist. We've also got this lovely detail of the polka dots on her sleeve, her bracelet, her ring, the fan, this wonderful hairstyle, full of interest and detail. And it seems likely, given the date, 1891, that this was a betrothal or engagement ring that she's wearing it. Violet married William Stockley, who we have heard of already, in 1892. Just to tell you a little bit about Stockley, he was a Dublin-born academic who had been educated at the same school in Rathmines as Walter and Charles Osborne, so they were family friends. He came from a well-to-do Protestant family with British military connections. Stockley's biographer described them as unionist in politics and high church Anglican in religion, which made his later conversion to Roman Catholicism and his support of Irish nationalism somewhat surprising. In 1886, he was appointed professor of French and English at the University of New Brunswick in Canada, and in 1892, he took a year's leave to study in France and to get married. So the marriage between Stockley and Violet Osborne took place at St. Bartholomew's Church on Clyde Road, which you can see here, in 1892. It's a really beautiful church. I love these photographs by Robert French. I think any excuse to take them out, but you get a sense of where they were. The ceremony was performed by the couple's brothers. They both had brothers who were in holy orders. So Charles Osborne and J.G. Stockley married them, along with Canon Richard Travers Smith, of whom Walter would later paint a striking portrait. And these details kind of again speak to the religious and social echelon to which the Osborne and Stockley families belonged. Before the newlyweds left for Canada, they held a farewell reception in Castlewood Avenue, I would imagine in the rooms that we see at the breakfast table, which was attended by their friends and neighbours, and a gossip magazine reported that the numerous and costly wedding presents occupied a prominent position in the pretty drawing rooms and were greatly admired by those present. I love little details like that. But this happiness and joy at their marriage was quite short-lived. 8 short months later, aged just 27, Violet died during the premature birth of her daughter, also named Violet, and who we see at the breakfast table. As Stephen Gwynne wrote, "The child that had been born into the world untimely, with all chances against it, throve and grew and was brought back across the ocean to the home from which her mother had gone out." We have in the Osborne archive in the National Gallery of Ireland this beautiful collection of items which kind of speak to the upheaval and the grief that William and Walter, and although he's not represented, I assume by extension Charles, felt after Violet's sudden death. They're held in this small leather wallet, which you see here at the bottom, which is embroidered with flowers. And there are 4 items held in it: 2 black bordered cards, visiting cards, one which reads, "From her beloved and much loving mother," and another from Walter, which reads, "In loving memory from her sorrowing brother." We have a clipping from a Canadian newspaper which contains a notice of her death, describing her as a lady of fine literary taste, of engaging manners and lovable disposition. There is also a clipping of a poem which I haven't been able to identify, but I'll just read a little bit of it. It says, "Oh, I am tired of having you dead, tired of waiting for the words unsaid, tired of the night and tired of the day, in the house that was home until you went away." So when we put these things together, Gwyn's evocation of Violet's role within the house on Castlewood Avenue, through to the sense of this change captured, I think, in the phrase, "house that was home," it is clear just how central a role the house played in the lives of the Osborne family. So I'm going to come back to the photograph and we'll step away from the family story just for a moment and look at some of Osborne's other paintings to kind of see where At the Breakfast Table fits in. So we have this photograph of the studio, and we know that Osborne spent much of the 1880s traveling in Britain, Belgium, and France. But he maintained a working studio in the house throughout this period. We see it in some different works, and here finally you get a glimpse of Stephen Gwyn, who I've been quoting liberally. This was painted in 1885, so quite an early work by Osborne. It's small in size, but Gwyn would later recall sitting for this, and he said, "It represents a very young man smoking a pipe while he reads, set up against a studio table littered with brushes and palettes, and a rough wall roughly papered with sketches. All this detail is ingeniously suggested, and finally, the gold mount of one sketch is so placed that the representation of its gilding lies up against the gilt of the frame." You'll have to imagine the frame of the painting on it here. Gwyn says this was a little touch of swagger whose success amply justifies it. "I can date this work, for the book was Kant's Ethics, which in 1885 I was reading for my degree." So they were old school friends, and I think this is the same space that we see the photograph in. As Gwyn describes, you have the works, the sketches, all pinned up. I'd also like to point out the blue and white china vase, which you see, the jar of paints, brushes, books, all of this kind of detritus of the studio, and this is important for what we'll see later on. It's also, I think, very easy to see in this painting the kind of domestic comfort of the studio, the congeniality of the studio, and the easy relationship between these two friends. We also see some of these details in Osborne's paintings of children. And I don't want to tread too much on Brendan Rooney's toes. He's written about Osborne's depiction of children for the catalogue, but these are 3 of my favourite Osborne paintings. They date from through the 1880s, 1886, 87, and 1885, and the painting in the middle is also included in the exhibition upstairs. But I hope you can see already some of the repetition of these details. Sketches or prints pinned to the wall, an interest in ceramics, blue and white china, a knife, a plate, a bowl, the interest in kind of very charming domestic features. Cats feature heavily in Osborne's paintings from this period, daffodils. These contrasts of colours of reds and blues and yellows are things that he will repeat throughout his work. So how might we fit these in a wider art historical context? Well, we could look at something like this, Edward Manet's portrait of Emile Zola from 1868. Yes, it differs greatly in scale, but I think it quite likely that when Osborne was painting his portrait of Gwyn, he may have been thinking of something like this, using the studio or the desk space to say something about the sitter. So in the portrait of Manet, we know what book he's holding. There's a print of his most famous painting. And Osborne's education in Belgium and France, along with the sources available to him in Dublin, would have meant he was very up to date with these developments in European paintings. As I mentioned earlier, Osborne was a member of the Dublin Art Club, but he had also been a member of the Dublin Sketching Club, which was another important artistic group in the city. And in the I'm going to get the date wrong, the 1870s, its kind of crowning achievement was the exhibition of work by James McNeill Whistler, the only exhibition of works to happen in Ireland by this artist, and among it were some of his best-known works. So even if you only know it from Mr. Bean, the arrangement in grey and black, number 1, of Whistler's mother was exhibited, as was his portrait of Thomas Carlyle, arrangement in grey and black, number 2. And again, if we think of that use of the interior setting, the simple chair, the side profile, and the prints or artworks depicted on the wall, again, this is something that Osborne is drawing into his own work. And we might also consider that in relation to this painting, which is in the exhibition. A little bit later, very sketchy, perhaps an unfinished work of the artist's mother reading, this time showing Osborne's mother rather than Whistler's mother. So when we keep all of these works in mind and we come back to At the Breakfast Table, we can start to see how Osborne was both fascinated by the figures but also this interior setting. It isn't anomalous in his work, it is very much coming from the works that preceded it. And he has the print on the wall, the flowers, the silverware, the ceramics. He's drawing all of these things together. He also, of course, drew on sketches. From the moment that the younger Violet came into the house, he's drawing her, for example, here being fed by a nurse, but also being held by her grandparents. So this is a sketch of Anne Osborne holding Violet, and this of his father, William Osborne, holding the child as well. There's also a work that I think was probably a preparatory watercolour for At the Breakfast Table, or something he would have drawn on. This is from around the same time, and it's inscribed Violet Stockley, aged 1 year, 8 months, and it's from 1894. But again, we see her at the high chair, very alert. If you look in the background of this, even though it's a loose watercolour, again, we see the chair that will come to the front in At the Breakfast Table, ceramics, candlesticks, papers, all of the kind of the things of everyday life. As the years passed, Osborne would become very fascinated with showing Violet's journey from infancy to girlhood, not just in the more formal portraits like Violet with Rabbit, which I'm not going to show here, but which you can see upstairs, but also in these sketches such as The Doll's School and At a Child's Bedside. So I think these are up in her bedroom on that upper story of Castlewood Avenue. But again, it was a house filled with visual arts. There's pictures everywhere. This was a very visually minded household. This is not of Violet, but again, it just gives a greater context to it. The house builders, a little bit later in 1902, showing a set of twins. And again, we see those same features in the background. But the work that I suppose kind of follows on from At the Breakfast Table is this painting, which again isn't in the exhibition, but I think it's kind of the next stage of Violet's story. This was painted in around 1901. And like we see in At the Breakfast Table, we have this profusion of domestic life that recalls both, as I say, At the Breakfast Table and even the portrait of Stephen Gwynn. We have the framed artworks, perhaps a larger portrait in the background, the glass bottle on top of the piano, the jug that we see just beside the older woman, the teacher in this instance, I think is almost exactly the one we see in At the Breakfast Table. And of course we see Violet, now age 7. She's sitting on that same dining room chair, but she has a cushion underneath her. as she kind of takes those first kind of tentative presses on the ivory keys of the piano. There is something I think of Anne Osborne in the younger woman beside her, but this is probably a friend or neighbour who has, or maybe another nurse or nanny or a governess who's come in to teach her. So this painting, the music lesson, was shown along with 270 of Osborne's works at a memorial exhibition in the Royal Hibernian Academy during the winter following his death. The Dublin Daily Express kind of singled out this work, and they said, anyone who has ever witnessed a music lesson will be at once struck by this. The attitude of the youthful performer as she bends slightly while her juvenile instructor points to a particular note. It shows what a keen observer of small details Walter Osborne was. And the Irish Times said, it tells a story, and no story could be told in words so eloquently as this little picture speaks in colour. It is a little masterpiece. What I find really interesting, though, is that these two works were shown in very close proximity to each other, to the extent that they couldn't be avoided by the reviewers that they showed kind of a growing up or a development of his work. So a reviewer wrote that a charming picture is portraits, so at the breakfast table, an interior darkened by heavy hangings. Upon the window, there is such a concentration of yellow light as to give the charm and contrast to the subdued tone of a very pleasing colour scheme. Very verbose description. But what these paintings show is the development of Violet Stockley's infancy and early childhood in Castlewood Avenue. From one, she moves from the watchful gaze of her grandparents and uncle, the unseen artist, to learning and taking her first steps in her own educational and creative life, still watched by her protective uncle. In a very different way, we have one final portrait of the Osborne family in Castlewood Avenue. This is their 1901 census return. And what we see here is all of them together. William Osborne, the head of the household, artist, and the RHA after his name signifies that he was a member of the Royal Hibernian Academy. Anne Osborne, there, read in white, age 74. Walter Osborne, artist, RHA. Violet Stockley, age 7, born in Canada. And then their domestic servant, Kate Brown, her name is as well. So here we have them together in this census, which was taken in early 1901. But very soon, in fact, in the same year, their lives were going to change again. Also, just as a point of interest, you'll notice that Violet was baptized Roman Catholic as well, so that was to do with her father's conversion, and it's just an interesting thing to note. So, within the first decade of the 20th century, the Osbornes' family life at Castlewood Avenue came to an end. William Osborne died in 1901, just months after the census was taken, followed by Walter, who died of pneumonia in 1903. And this was a huge shock to the Irish art world. He was really at the height of his career when he dies very suddenly. At the time of her death in 1910, Anne Osborne was living with William Stockley and his second wife, Marie Germaine Kolb, a German woman in Cork in the south of Ireland. And the 1911 census recorded that Violet, by then age 17, was a boarder at a convent school in Wandsworth in London. The diaries of Alois Fleischmann, a composer, a musicologist, from 1926 and 1927, suggest that Violet frequently travelled back to her father and stepmother's home in Cork, but she ultimately made her life in England, where she worked as a teacher in Cheltenham Ladies' College. Another little aside, but you'll have noticed on some of the images that they were donated by a woman called Sophie Mallon. And for any Irish history enthusiasts, this is an interesting connection. Sophia was Stockley's daughter from his second marriage, and she married James Lawrence Mallon in 1933, who was the son of Michael Mallon, who had been a signatory of the 1916 proclamation and who was executed for his role in the Easter Rising in 1916. So it's just one of those little, for Irish history enthusiasts, it's one of those little interesting points. So over the approximately 40 years of their residence in Castlewood Avenue, the home played a very important role in the Osbornes' domestic and in Walter's professional life. It is memorialized through his paintings of its interior, and paintings like At the Breakfast Table, the portrait of Stephen Gwynne, and the music lesson captured the private moments of their home, placing the Osborne family and their extended circle on public display for generations to come. The aesthetic and narrative value of these paintings is clearly evident, but it's the personal stories of the family, their friendships with neighbours and old school friends, their happy memories, and their periods of grief that enrich our understanding and enjoyment of these works. Thank you very much. We do have a microphone for questions. If you would like to put up your hand, Eva Marie will come if anyone has a question.
Sorry, I have a question about the paintings in which you've made reference to Whistler, or you've made reference to Manet, the Zola. You know, with Zola, for example, or Courbet, we've been able to identify oftentimes what's pinned to the wall behind. Have you been able to identify paintings within the paintings or drawings within the painting?
Unfortunately not, no, and I'll just go back to the portrait of Stephen Gwynne. He very gently obscures any detail. What I will say in this one in particular, that very thick gold mount is quite Whistlerian in its setting. So I think he's giving the illusion, but he's not committing to any details in any of them, unfortunately. But more that general sense of what his studio was like.
Thanks very much for a very interesting lecture. I was just wondering, was there any particular reason why Osborne would have chosen to go to Antwerp as opposed to, say, England or France or elsewhere? Someone who used to live in Belgium earlier in my career, just curious about that. Thanks.
Yeah, there's a great question, and I'll just say for anyone who hasn't seen the exhibition, Osborne initially trained as an artist in Dublin and then went to the Academy Royale, or the Royal Academy in Antwerp, to further his artistic training. And there are very good reasons for that. One, the classes were in English, so you didn't need a second language, and also it was really cheap. And so it was much cheaper than going to Paris or going to London, and he was on a scholarship. So he had gotten a scholarship from it's called the Taylor Prize. It still exists today, administered by the Royal Dublin Society. And Osborne and many other Irish artists go to Antwerp at the end of the 19th century. They enjoy the lessons. It's a very particular way of painting. The light, the greys, the blues that you see in his painting is all coming from the training he had in Antwerp. And so often they would go do their classes, work through the system in Antwerp, and then on their way back to Ireland, kind of travel through France and Belgium, maybe come home through England, which is what Osborne did, and bring all of these ideas back to Ireland. So bringing the European way of tradition and new things that are happening back to Ireland. So yeah, very good reasons.
Do you know anything about his personal life? I mean, it's very clear from his paintings that he had a lot of affection for baby Violet, and yet it seemed he was kind of a perpetual bachelor, but maybe that was due to the responsibilities of taking care of his family, so just curious.
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. We know that he was potentially engaged to a woman called Nellie O'Brien, who was the sister of another artist, Dermot O'Brien, who also studied in Antwerp. But it's kind of more hearsay, like there's nothing very definite, and we don't know of any other significant relationships. I think he took the role of like protective uncle very seriously, and I suppose as the son who was at home to also take care of his parents, who were quite elderly when this little child comes into their home. He seems to have been very gregarious. He had lots of friends and a very active social life, but yet we have too few details on any special relationships. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for a lovely talk. Could you speak a little bit more about his use of light and shadow? I have to admit, when I first saw it at the breakfast table, I didn't even see the grandfather at first glance.
I will say that it's a painting that is very difficult to reproduce, and coming to see the exhibition on Sunday was the first time I had seen this painting in person, which was also great, and it's beautifully lit in the exhibition, and you do get some of those details come out a little more. I think there's a couple of things to consider. One is that sense of the enclosed interior and trying to get the effect of the sunlight coming through the window. Maybe he went a little overboard with the browns. I would also say that there's the potential that the coloring of the painting has changed over time. For example, if he was using a particular type of paint that maybe has bitumen or something in it, that it has darkened. But I think it's almost like all of the focus is falling on Violet, and that especially his father is an incidental detail, because yes, he does kind of disappear into the curtains a little bit. Whereas when you look, despite that, he's building up this row that's all coming towards the child. So it's all leading our eye. If we're looking at it from left to right, if we're thinking Art History 101, it's all leading to in this gorgeous curve towards Violet, and she's in full light. He is, if you look at some of the landscape paintings, and I don't have any reproductions of those, he is interested in the effects of sunlight, shadows, all of that type of thing, and that's coming from his training in Antwerp, how the kind of naturalist painters were interested in light as well. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Thank you. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you.
I'm struck by the difference in the facial expression of baby Violet in this painting, and I suppose the sharpness of the features that we see in the sketch that you...
I'll go forward.
The sketch and the paint. I think there was a watercolor as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how, in a sense, when we look at the picture, she's foregrounded, but at the same time, there's a kind of imprecision in the features of her face by comparison to the features of the face of the grandmother.
I think part of that is the reproduction as well. But yes, I agree that the watercolor is finer, the sketches are finer. Partly that could be technique. In terms of just capturing that in oils. But I wonder also if there's a familiarity with his mother as well that was easier to capture than painting a child as well who's, you know. Yes. Piercing eyes, exactly, yes. But I think if you look at this portrait of Anne and the single portrait of her, which I can go back to, here, there's definitely a similarity, and maybe it was a face he obviously knew very well, so maybe some of a son's love for his mother coming through in some of the detail as well.
So thank you for this great talk, Katie. You've been working on Walter Osborne for quite a long time now, and so I just wanted to ask you, what continues to draw you to this artist or delight you about this artist, or does he come to life for you in any new ways as you've been looking at him across this time?
That's a really great question. I think I first started writing about Walter Osborne in 2012, maybe, so it has been a long road, and it's such a pleasure to see so many of his works in one place, and I think for me that's such a treat that this exhibition has happened, so thank you for that. I think he is interesting in the sense that he has this European training, that he isn't it's hard to think of the way to describe it, but his interest in Dublin, in the city, the people he's interacting with, he brings together lots of different threads. So his works are interesting, of course. The way he exhibits his work is really interesting because, yes, they were well-to-do, but he also did have to make a living. So when we look at how he exhibits in Dublin, in London, in Liverpool, in Birmingham, he shows his work almost until he sells it. I think the artists that he was friends with are really interesting. And for me, it really is that he brings us out of Ireland, but then also brings, say, British and French and Belgian painting into Ireland. And so we get this really rich European history, which maybe sometimes gets a little bit overlooked when we're thinking about Ireland at that time. And I find that really interesting. I also just love cities and how artists behave in cities, and so Osborne has everything because he both paints it and sketches it and walks around in it, and he writes in his diaries about the streets he's visiting, but then he also is in clubs and he goes for dinner and he goes to different shops, so you get such a great sense of Dublin through his career more broadly from this time.
Well, thank you very much for coming.